Thank you so much, Cornell and Linda. That was a fascinating and really informative view of the research that you've been doing. There's so many issues and so many questions that pop up. There's building the public's case, there's creating the political support or building on the political support, the questions on how you finance this, on how you determine eligibility, how you distribute it, so many facets to it. I guess I want to open up with just the question on political support and kind of your assessment of where political support stands right now. Before I ask you to comment on that, I would just like to remind our listeners to please go ahead and submit your questions again via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But where would you assess this in terms of political support? This is clearly something that the Biden administration has mentioned, has kind of focused on somewhat, but tell us more.
Sure. Well, let me just begin by noting where we are in this discussion, right? So literally going back to the days of Jefferson and Frederick Douglass, going back to the Field Order 15, this has been a matter of aspiration. We are in a moment in which this is a matter of political and fiscal possibility, where we have at least the candidates from one of the major parties all saying that we should have a commission on reparations. That suggests that this is in fact possible. We go back to the way reparations were granted to Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. There was never popular support. If you look at the letters that were written to Congress, there was never a groundswell of popular support, but a growing recognition that this was something America needed to do. And with the development of the narrative, right? In other words, why should we do it? And a greater appreciation of how it might be done as a matter of law and as a matter of fiscal policy, that was done. The Congressional Black Caucus supported that back then. At this moment, we see a broad range of political constituencies. We see American towns and cities and states looking at how they might engage in reparatory justice. We see universities endeavoring to do the same. So what I'm suggesting to you is not merely the number of constituencies, not merely the number of entities, but also the diversity of entities make it clear that this is politically possible. And what is, I think, very encouraging is through the research of my colleague and students is it's fiscally possible, and that there's precedent for
it. If I can just add something on this. My first job out of college, I spent 2 years working as a political pollster. I've always liked numbers. And so one thing I learned was that the answer to any question depends on what question you ask. And so if you ask the general public today, how do you feel about slavery reparations? You would get an overwhelmingly negative response. If you ask the general public, how would they feel about charging an excise tax on every to mortgage lenders on every house sold, that would be a few dollars, that would compensate those who suffered from housing discrimination, you would probably get a very different response. I would suspect that a majority of Democrats and independents would be supportive. So I think that one of the problems that we have faced is that we have not really looked in the details. The devil is really in the details on this issue, which is one of the things the students did so incredibly well in setting up the Kumu. And this is so ordinary and so everyday in terms of how we do it and all the multiplicity of ways to fund different types of it, that it is a problem that I think works better if it is looked at in its components rather than simply at the overall high level.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Gerben Scherkbier says, thanks so much for this thought-provoking research. Did the research suggest anything like a quantified range of harms? In other words, are there any rough estimates on what the financial harms per person might be?
Cornell, I think you can take this one, and then I can also chime in.
Well, I'll just simply say that when you look at the work of Bill Darity at Duke, who's certainly talked about $1 trillion plus price tags, it suggests that the number is large, right? I've hesitated to have the conversation about how large the check should be per person, as opposed to having the conversation about the kinds of harms that should be recognized, the ways in which we might finance reparation and restoring to some degree, and making people whole to the extent that we can, as opposed to how large the check is per person. I'll defer to my colleague on that. What I do want to underscore here is, for the longest time, the complexity of the math has literally paralyzed the discussion about the morality and necessity of reparations. And so our research suggests the math is possible, that it can be done. And with that said, I'll turn it back over to Linda.
Yeah, hi. So I have spent a lot of my career on thinking about the overall huge costs of different kinds of things. For example, what is the total cost of the long-term cost of the post 9/11 wars, which is now in numbers that we released yesterday, over 7 trillion. But just because there is a large number doesn't mean that that is what the governments can do, or that that's the government's responsibility. So Gerben, to give you an answer close to your heart, our studies show that the American public places a value on the national parks of $92 billion. Now, the government actually funds the national parks at only $2.5 billion, so a very small fraction of the total value of the parks. And that doesn't even include all the ecosystem values. I mean, and in this case, there have been large studies about the enormous amount of debt, but there is a principle and a norm in the government of starting somewhere by recognizing that a harm is done and beginning to work on ways to think about compensating for some of the effects of the harm. The United States is never going to be able to compensate for what happened at the beginning of the founding of the country and before. It can compensate some of the descendants for some of the consequences of 400 years of discrimination. So the American Indian Trust Fund is an interesting example, because at the time of, in 2010, during the Obama administration, there was a quantification of the present value of the losses to the native tribes that had lost their control of the resources, which was about $50 billion. But the settlement reached that the government agreed to pay and has paid was about $4 billion. So it was much less, but still it was a start, and it was a turning point in terms of being able to recognize and to begin to deal with some of the consequences of this.
Thank you. We have a question from George Eden, and he asks, has there ever been an attempt, sort of following on the financial question, has there ever been an attempt to prioritize the numerous justifications for financial remedy for harms by the government, either in an annual budget process or as an oversight of expenditures? So I guess to your point, Linda, the government may not be able to compensate the full breadth of harms done, but has there previously been an effort to take a part and to put that into the budget process?
So I think that's a really interesting question. My reading of it is that this huge list of compensatory restitution programs is pretty idiosyncratic, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason, for example, to why, particular illnesses and diseases have government restitution and other ones don't. I would imagine that has more to do with advocacy and political pressures. What is clear is that in almost any kind of program one could imagine that deals with some of the consequences of discriminatory anti-Black laws, you can find a precedent in the many, many different programs that exist, because there are so many different principles laid out, because basically the government in each and every one of those, if you look at, as I've been doing now, and you study the charter and you look at the laws, they all start with something that kind of acknowledges that this is harming some subset of individuals, and that the government is attempting, regardless of its role, to mitigate that harm or to address some of the effects of the harm financially.
May I add an answer by way of analogy? So when it comes to enforcing the nation's civil rights laws, the Justice Department has essentially two types of tools. You have criminal prosecutions and you have civil prosecutions. When you prioritize your civil prosecutions, you're essentially seeking money damages. So in the case of housing discrimination, when the Justice Department says we're going to prioritize home mortgages in terms of discrimination, we will go after the banks. We will devise settlements that ensure that these victims receive this amount of restitution. These banks are responsible for educating people as to the availability of mortgages. These banks will be responsible to put people in a position where they can get credit, whether it be in terms of mortgages or small businesses. The point being here is the ordering of prosecutorial priorities is in effect a prioritization, if you will, of reparatory justice. Because what you're saying here is we're going after these civil rights wrongs, these deprivations, these racial harms, and we're going through settlement agreements, prioritize certain kinds of compensation. Because to be clear, that's exactly what you do. You create a settlement agreement that says we have a victim fund that looks like this. People receive this kind of compensation, and beyond money, we're going to order these kinds of programmatic responses. So that's one way we do it. It is still, I agree with my colleague, idiosyncratic, but it suggests that that kind of prioritization can be done with respect to reparatory compensation.
Okay, thank you. David Wood has a question.